Okay. Cool, we are live. Oh, there's Allison right there. There you are. Hey, how are you?
Hey, how are y'all doing?
Good, good. Okay. I'm gonna send everyone the link for the YouTube live, and then I'm gonna start broadcasting, okay? So I know I made a mistake the last time and started talking all foolish, and it was like, you know.
And it was broadcasting.
Yes, it was broadcasting. And I was like, okay, the people are coming in. And I was like, oh my goodness, let me stop playing. All right, let me send out this YouTube live stream. Perfect. Great. Yes. I'm so excited. All panelists. Okay, cool. Woo. This was easier. How are you doing, Allison?
I'm good. How are you? Sorry I was late. I was like running around doing stuff and completely got lost track of time.
No worries. It's completely fine. Trust me. I almost forgot. I'm like, I have to set like 10,000 reminders because I'm like, there's always something going on. So no worries at all. Let me see. When does the semester fully start, Trinice?
Ooh, look, I have to check my phone because I don't even know. I don't even want to go. 2 weeks from now.
Okay.
Actually, yeah, the 20th, but really classes I think start like the 24th.
I've even forgotten. I was just like, as long as they don't, you're teaching? Are you teaching?
No, not this semester, and I am so grateful. Please don't write, please don't call, none of that. Leave me alone.
I was like, I'm not teaching Nathan nothing. Y'all got me for that year and some change. I'm like, I'm not doing it.
Don't pay me enough for the stress. I'm good. Not this
I know. A mess. Penelope, how about you?
We start for GSC September 2nd. I think that's when classes start. Yeah, but it's gonna be all online, so it'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
that sounds good.
Yeah, they sent an email. I think they decided, was it in June, late June, early July? They sent an email, so I was like, all right, that's all I needed to know.
That's great. That's so great. Yeah, I remember like when I went to Temple for undergrad, and I went to HBCU. I recognized HBCUs end early, and then we go back earlier, and then I didn't realize that, and I was making fun of my sister when she would go to school. But meanwhile, we just end early and go in early, but it's all good. Oh wow, we have a lot of folks coming in. Cool. I'm gonna wait like a minute or so until we start, so we can have a little bit more people come in. And also the article, oh, Philly, okay. What's up, Philly? What's up, Cincy? Albuquerque, this is so great. Someone said A. Corona, California. That's so cool. Welcome. London. Oh, hey. Oh, South Side of Chicago. Yes. Houston. H-Town? No. I was actually born there. Didn't stay there long. San Diego. Cali. Colorado. Oh, South Africa. Wow. Welcome. Hello, Bay Area. Oh, someone's from the Bronx. Cleopatra from the Bronx. Hey. This is someone's from South Nigeria. Oh, wow. Okay. This is so great. So great. Well, let's get started, y'all, if that's okay with you guys. You guys ready? Great. So, hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Swift. I'm the executive director of Black Women Radicals. It's super nice to be here again with everyone for part 2 of The Revolution Will Be Archived. The first one we had, about like a month or 2 ago? And it was on IG Live and it went by super fast. We only got to do one question with everyone. And everyone from the first part 1 is here, except for Megan. But she's with us in spirit. But we're super excited to be here again for part 2 of The Revolution Will Be Archived and discussing how feminist archiving is as a tool for liberation, as a tool for resistance and resilience, and to overcome what we know as white supremacist revisionist history, right? And so before we get started, I would really like to lay down the ground rules that Black Women Radicals has. As if you've joined our other events, you know, this is a safe space for everybody. So we don't allow any transphobia, queerphobia, homophobia, ableism, sexism, any sort of anything antagonizing, oppressive, we do not allow. So just put that out there. And if something happens, I will have to kick you out. And I really don't want to do that, but just letting y'all know. But once again, thank you so much for being here. And I'm so happy for the panelists, Penelope, Trinice, Zoe, Allison, Ayling to be here. So I really want to very quickly read your bios briefly, because I know we did this a month or 2 ago, but people should know how poppin' y'all are, right? So I really want to just introduce y'all again. So great. So let me get started. So I'm going to do Allison. Allison Bantimba. She, her, hers is a racial justice organizer and consultant. She founded and leads the Fulton County Remembrance Coalition to engage the community in the Equal Justice Initiative's Community Remembrance Project. The project is an effort to memorialize the 36 Black men, women, and children who were lynched in Fulton County through soil collections and historical markers installations. In response to the recent violence against Black people, Allison organized a space to center Black grief and allow for Black folks to collectively process grief and other emotions in a safe space. So please give it up for Allison and the great work that she does. Woo. So next up is Ayling Zulema Dominguez, who is a first-generation Dominicana Mexicana living in the Bronx, New York. As a poet and creative in an abolitionist mindset, her work has long been the stuff of forging community, of affirming belonging as the first step toward liberation, of imagining new, better, and more radically loving worlds. In 2019, she graduated from the University of Chicago with a BA in comparative race and ethnic studies. Knowing that a sense of belonging is counterfactual and ephemeral if we do not work to liberate others, her writing and creative work do not only celebrate joyful resistance, but also pushes her readers to actively oppose systems of oppression. So give it up for Ayling, who's also, I just want to point out this event is in collaboration with Ayling and Penelope of Collective Resistance. So thank you so much, Ayling. Next up is Penelope. Penelope, she, her, is a Black Dominican youth worker, doula, and digital artist from the Bronx. Woo, boogie down Bronx. As a Black feminist whose work is centered on conspiring with her community on ways to subvert and disrupt structural and systemic forms of violence, she dedicates herself to co-creating spaces of community-based political education centered on a practice of abolitionist teaching. She's currently a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania and is creating Bronx magic at Collective Resistance through the form of community archiving, through creation of Black feminist learning spaces for young people, and community-centered events on supporting incarcerated survivors and Black mamas. So give it up for Penelope. Next up is Zoë Pulley, she, her. Zoë is a designer based in Brooklyn, New York. Her work is motivated around the concept of preserving generational narratives of Black experiences through print media, textiles, and various other mediums. Her most current project, called the Black Joy Archive, is a collaborative effort intended to serve Black people through an open call for images of Black joy. The goal is that this collective action can serve as a therapeutic practice in self-preservation and self-esteem, while also demystifying the notion that Black lives can be solely viewed in a negative vacuum of struggle. This fall, Zoe will be attending Rhode Island School of Design as a presidential fellow to pursue her MFA in graphic design, with a long-term goal to create and foster more design spaces that include Black and Brown people. Oh, congratulations, Zoe. Give it up.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. And last but not least, of course, Trinice McNally. Oh my gosh, she, her, Trinice, so wonderful. Trinice McNally is a Black queer feminist organizer, student affairs professional, and educator. She is a nationally recognized transformative leader who is committed to the liberation of all Black people. She is the founding director of the University of the District of Columbia Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Multicultural Affairs. So give it up for Trinice, everybody. So amazing. And I got it right this time. Listen, I'm getting the UDC Sedema down, right? So we're super excited to have this conversation, and let's just get into it because I want to make sure that we have all the time to discuss. So our first theme of tonight is focusing on sankofa. The term sankofa means a lot to me. It means a lot to other people. So if people don't know, sankofa is derived from the Akan peoples of West Africa, and is specifically derived from the word san, which means return, ko, which means go, and fa, look, seek, and take. So the word literally translates to, it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. And so when we think of sankofa, we also think about archiving, right? And fetching what is at risk of being left behind, in our case, in feminist archiving. So the first question is, in your archiving journey, how has the concept of sankofa impacted you personally, politically, intellectually, and spiritually? And what have been some positives and also difficulties in going back to fetch what is at risk of being left behind? And anyone can go first, don't be scared. Do I have to pick somebody?
I can go.
Okay.
So what we're doing with the Fulton County Remembrance Coalition and with the Equal Justice Initiative is quite literally going back and fetching what is very much at risk of being left behind. The stories of people who were lynched throughout the nation are hidden, are skewed, are told as ghost stories, are retold as vampire stories, and just completely eliminated in all ways. And when we've met the pushback of why are we talking about this? Why are we bringing up such a painful history and that type of stuff? But it really, for me and for the coalition, we've seen the purpose in doing this work, but it's really come to light for a lot of other members of the community in Atlanta, especially in the wake of the protests and the uprisings that are happening around the country. Just because we're seeing the exact same responses from the city to this racial violence as we were trying to bring to light over the past year and a half. And it's important to have these conversations. So we could have kind of missed out on the negative responses to the racial violence that we're seeing now, and even missed out on the racial violence that we're seeing now if we had really kind of confronted what has happened in the past.
I'll jump in really quick. Jamie, you said personally, spiritually,
Politically,
intellectually?
Yes, that's right.
I'll start with spiritually. I think as I started to uncover the history around African traditional religion, it really shifted my political commitment, my personal commitments. And I think obviously it kind of led to my intellectual commitments around what is important and like what is a tradition that I should be following in. So I think for me, it kind of all tied into one like way of being, right? Which I think everything kind of naturally happens. And when I think about Sankofa and like what our commitment is in the Black radical tradition to like uncovering our history, it's been painful, right? It's been beautiful. And it's also been painful to know that a lot of the things that I was taught like were not true, right? Or like were incomplete stories, which invisibilized a large group of people, right? And those people are usually who we call folks on the margins now, right? So like as I uncovered like what was true about Yoruba and about Ifa and Candomblé and like all of these traditions now that I practice in, I felt like, wow, like what the hell have I been doing, right? For 30 years, right? And like what would be possible if like our recent ancestors over the last 50 years would have been able to practice and open, right? Like what would be possible at HBCUs, right? If we would tell the truth, right? About the ways that like our folks like access this land, right? And like the true ways that archiving was built. So it's been beautiful and it's also been painful. And I think it has led to my personal and political commitment to ensure that HBCUs do become liberatory environments.
Thank you both for sharing that, really. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in just to like piggyback off of Trinice, but I guess speaking more on a personal and spiritual level, I know personally for me growing up, as I'm sure many of us on this panel and many other people listening have experienced, representations of people that look like us have always been, you know, null and void or barely existing. And then piggybacking off of what Trinice said, just overall history that we are taught throughout grade school and even in the higher educational realm, we know it tends to be revisionist history. I know personally for me, it wasn't until I attended an HBCU my freshman year that I really began to learn more of the scholarly people and just outside of academia, just people, political people that were setting the ground and setting our history and really have been here, but we have not talked about them. So for me, it always felt important to make sure that we archived or collected our histories, even if it was just on a family level. But now, as I get older and I realize how revisionist history runs rampant, I feel like there's more of a collective need for all of us to come together in some sort of way, whether it's through certain spaces, certain organizations, whatever it may be, with the sole goal to make sure that we are writing our own histories. When I think of Sankofa also, I think of the overall action of, you know, collecting stories, remembering, and how there's a lot of positivity around it. Of course, we're in charge of what we're putting out there, of what's remembered, but at the same time, there's a lot of pain for people who have been marginalized, who have gone through a lot of trauma within this country. So I feel like there's a duality there that's important to pay attention to while we're still trying to make sure that we're making sure we're not just fringe and that our voices are just fringe experiences. We have to also realize that the action of archiving and going back in our history does allow us to also, I guess, process certain traumas, confront certain stories that are harder for us to process. And hopefully taking that difficult or sometimes difficult route will allow us to then be even stronger and, I don't know, be able to tell our stories more openly, I guess more honestly. And yeah. And sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but now that I'm thinking about trauma and story retelling, it brought up this one book called My Grandmother's Hands. I want to say the author's name is Resmaa Menakem. I might be butchering his last name, but he writes this really, he's this therapist, but he writes this really wonderful story just discussing how we process racialized trauma through storytelling and through like confronting our stories. So yeah, just a little ad lib there.
Definitely. Thanks so much for sharing that. Penelope, Zoe?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Penelope, Ayling.
I think thinking about spirituality and I'm thinking about like emotional and visual reactions to archiving too. I think that my first reaction in like thinking about that question is what people echoed before, which is like pain. You know, I can remember sitting in classes and like, you know, in undergrad or even in grad school and looking into our archives of slavery in the Caribbean, right? And the impact of Black women in the Caribbean, and sobbing, like at a coffee shop across the street, like sobbing and having very real reactions to the things that I was reading. And then understanding that there's some of those lineages I can trace directly to my family, right? And some of those lineages can be traced directly to the spaces and the communities that I call home or that I have grown to call home. And then I'm also thinking about the validity of self that being able to archive or take archiving into my own hands gives me, right? This, I think I was facilitating a program for the past 2 weeks, and one of the things we kept talking about with the young folks that we were working with was the ways that Black feminists, when we're thinking about the Combahee River Collective, practice self-determination, right? And in that practice of self-determination, I can see that being applicable to us taking archiving into our own hands and into our own communities. Because for me, it offers a way to be able to, yes, name myself and define myself, but to also create and map out lineages of resistance that have existed before, but have been either abruptly erased or have just fallen through the cracks, right? To no fault of, my community, to no fault of my people, but simply just because there was no time, right? There was no time to hold these things sacred, or there was no time to, put this in a scrapbook, right? Or to put this in a photo album, or to take that newspaper clipping. So I think of it as, when you're looking back, when you're taking what is at risk of being left behind, you're also giving validity to self, and you're extending yourself, or you're extending to your community the grace that is needed to be able to say, these are the pain, right? This is the joy, and these are the in-betweens that exist. And how can we honor all these pieces at the same time? And how can all these pieces be used in order to create, a new world, right? In order to exist at the end of this world, and in order to map out new possibilities.
Yeah, definitely. I think my response is going to take bounce off a little bit of what everyone said. I think as a poet, I looked at it first as kind of like the individual words and what it means to return, to go, to look and seek and take. And I think for me, it's been a really good reminder and grounding practice, because in returning, archiving is no easy practice, and it's not just a brief revisiting to a family photo album, and it's not just like brief things, it's a very deep going into this. And there has our archive, the Black and Brown Essential Worker Archive, started out of my family. It was inspired by that. And so there was this initial pushback and this initial notion of this is taboo. We shouldn't really delve into this too much. What's the reason? I don't have time for it. It's not practical, or it doesn't serve me. And so there's kind of a delving into why it does actually, and what it does for us. So it's been a really good reminder whenever there is a little bit of feeling of tabooness to it. And I think as well, there's this question of what is at risk of being left behind? What is our archive going to deal with and grapple with? And how do we go about that? How do we make sure that those who we want to be included are, and we're not excluding, although inherently archives kind of, there's parameters. And so it's been a really good kind of constant reminder and grounding practice and motivation as well to keep going whenever there is a little bit of pushback.
Yeah, I thank everyone for sharing. It's so difficult because I have to look, like Penelope, you said, I have to look through slavery archives in Brazil, and then you have to look at, I think that a lot of us have done a great job in uncovering our past. However, we know that there are some things that can never be uncovered. We will never be able to uncover certain stories, certain people, like, we won't know certain people's names. A lot of times in archives, they're not named by name. They're named as something derogatory. And I think it does something, like you said, Penelope, there's like a visceral reaction that you have to it. And it's like, wow, this is what we were reduced to, or I can't trace my lineage back. I personally don't know. And I know I could, and there's other mechanisms too that I don't trust all the time, but I'm not going to get into that. But, it's like, if you look at someone's face, this person looks like they could be a part of my family. It's that fictive kinship there. It's like, who is this girl looking so sad in this archive? I think Saidiya Hartman's book, what is it? Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. I think that's what it's called, the book. And she does a great job at taking these photos and archives and taking, true factual information, historical information, and critical fabulation. That's her theoretical process. She creates and imagines what would have happened to these people, and what would their stories be about, and how could she characterize them through historical information, but also through her imaginative lens. And it's like, damn, we got to do that to uncover our stories. We have to do that to find out who we are. And I think there's a beauty in that, right? The resilience of Black and brown people to, like, we are some, I'm not going to curse, but we are some resilient mother effers, like, I'm serious. But then it's like, damn, we have to do that, and I think that's like the spiritual part. I feel too. It's like, wow, it's something missing. But then you find this information, I'm like, wow, maybe I'm not related to this person, but that fictive kinship, it's like, this person is a part of me too. So I appreciate everyone saying that. Now we're going to transition into something a little juicy. No, I'm kidding, not it's going to be juicy. But, I would like to talk about, we talked about, like, the visceral and spiritual and understandings of the archive and how it feels to go back, and the positives and difficulties. But I really want to get into kind of this part 2 of racism, sexism, and queerphobia and transphobia, and how we look at the co-optation, exclusion, and the revising of archives. So we talked about this before, and we touched on it now. But I mentioned Saidiya Hartman, but Saidiya Hartman has this great piece called Venus in Two Acts, where she discusses the implicit and explicit violence of the archive, and particularly how, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, heteronormative violence is put onto the archives, especially the language, right? And when you look at archives, sometimes you see like a description of, particularly in Brazil, a description of a mixed race Black woman, and it would be like a mulatto instead of the person's name. You know what I'm trying to say? So do you mind sharing how you personally have experienced this in your work and in your everyday lives? And also, have you faced any pushback in regards to addressing revisionist histories in the archive? Because I got some stories for days, y'all, but y'all go ahead. Does anyone want to jump in?
Here, I'll jump in first. Yeah, just thinking about specifically language that's used in archiving, or just like any sort of historical context. We all know that there's a decolonization there that needs to happen, or that's happening, but at a very slow rate. Speaking specifically to archiving, I can think of multiple examples, even in major institutions, one specifically in DC that is a wonderful institution, but sometimes when you see certain things listed out just walking through the museum, you take a second, you're like, so with that, language is important, words matter. And I'm not saying that anyone can be perfect or any organization can be perfect, but there's an accountability that I feel when you're speaking to, I guess, preserving histories, writing histories, whatever it may be, that you should constantly be making sure that you're held accountable and you're holding others accountable. So there's that. And there was another point that I wanted to make, speaking on languages, but yeah, that slipped my mind. But yeah, essentially, we have to all make sure that we're using words that that are taking account for the different experiences that we may be speaking to when speaking to a certain image. Speaking specifically to the project that I'm working on right now, Black Joy Archive, I mean, you gave the little spiel about it, but essentially I wanted to do this action, this collective action with people to hopefully allow people I was calling it therapeutic, but a positive process in which they're able to look back in their own personal photos, have that personal connection to the archive experience, and hopefully help them, you know, with overall self-esteem, because it's been pretty tough these last few months, all things considered. But even with that, I recognize when I put this project out there, there's a connotation right away for certain audiences. When they think of Black joy, we all know that Black is cool, Black is co-opted, Blackness is cool, Blackness is something that's palatable to white audiences. So I wanted to make sure that this project was really serving Black people and Black experiences versus white audiences being able to feel like, oh yeah, like I can get on board with this because these are images of Black people that I'm comfortable with, or images that I like to relate to and post on social media, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I guess, again, using the word duality, but just recognizing that there's multiple facets here when you're archiving or preserving history. It's not just one fairy tale that's going to, like, you know, be recognized. You have to realize that there are multiple ways that we have to approach a story, recognize a story, and recognize how it might be processed by somebody. Yeah.
One thing that I'm thinking about, and I think Trinice, you talked about this in the last, the first part too, but I'm thinking about acts of violence that people deem simple or kind of like brush away. And it's like, yo, actually, no, like this is deeply harmful. When we're thinking about, there's a community member, her name is Darielle, and on Instagram, she created like a slide thing. And the post was centered on the pronouns that we use to address, people who, ancestors, to address historical figures, to address people who we, as, you know, either scholars in institutions or scholars like in our communities, who we study or who we try to revive. And the act of using gendered pronouns to address somebody who, like, you actually don't even know who this person was. You actually don't even know, you don't know nothing, right? You don't know nothing, right? Because of the limited text that's provided, or the limited archive that's provided. So for Venus in Two Acts, Hartman talks about, when she's talking about Venus and the sentence that she's reduced to, right? Thinking about, I forgot what the sentence was, but talking about the sentence that she is reduced to, saying like, and another girl, you know, died, or another girl was murdered, something along those lines. And, you know, I think in the essay, you know, Venus, Hartman is specifically thinking about how is it that we can piece together or recreate or retell stories that we find in the archive, as a way to reclaim, or as a way to comfort ourselves, and as a way to imagine different possibilities. And also, when we're reading into these texts, the harm that we create and that we perpetuate, or that we reinstate onto these folks who have already been reduced to one sentence, have already been reduced to one simple act of violence, right? And then we are, in our attempt to sort of reclaim or dig something up, or to honor, right? To loosely honor, we are reinstating violence, bless you. We are reinstating violence through misgendering, right? Or through attaching name or attaching identities that we don't actually even really know if it's true or not. Yeah, that's something that I was just thinking about. I don't have anything else to say.
Yo, Penelope, I really appreciate that offering, because it immediately made me think of Polly Murray. and the ways that all of these institutions, mainly Howard, like refuses to acknowledge Polly Murray as a non-binary person, right? Like when we're very clear, right? That like they may not have had the language back then, but like, yeah, reading in between the lines, like looking at their documentation, looking at how they lived, even through like their priesthood, even from the CCC with Eleanor Roosevelt, like even look at that gang of friends, right? And this is how I've personally kind of experienced it. I guess this is where like you get all the tea in archiving, which is why I love it. I went to Bethune-Cookman, and when I was an undergrad, one of my jobs was to serve as a curator in her home. So, you know, I just used to go through all the documents, you know. I saw Eleanor Roosevelt had a guest room, and the only two people that were documented to really stay there was like Jackie Robinson and Eleanor. Everyone knows that Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor was thick as thieves, right? Everyone knows that Eleanor Roosevelt had a lot of gay friends. Everybody know that FDR weren't shit, right? Like, so I was like, so it's getting real good. It's getting real good, right? Like, so there are also some unpublished papers in Beverly Guy Sheftall's project with, they did like an archival project with the Arcus Foundation in 2006. And there's a lot of unpublished like papers on like Black queer history. So like the direct impact for me and like many other queer students and just like folks at HBCUs has like, you've robbed us of possibility. You robbed me of like a possibility model, right? You robbed me of knowing like who my potential founder could be, right? I don't want to get sued because I'm gonna say my Sarah was a lesbian. I believe everybody, they all was queer, right? As far as I'm concerned, right? Like what is actually straight? Like what does that really mean when we think about the word? But it robs so many people of like our dignity, of our possibility, of our humanity to be seen, not just as normal, but like as human, right? Like, and I think that when they took that away from us, like just going through her things in that home, if you see how close Eleanor Roosevelt's room is to Mary McLeod Bethune's room, and if you see all these photos, right, and if you see and you learn about the ways when Lucille Diggs Slow was being attacked by Mordecai Johnson, who were the Black civil rights leaders that came to her rescue? Mary McLeod Bethune was one of them. Eleanor Roosevelt also became an honorary member of AKA. Lucille Diggs Slow was just the founder, right? Like I spent hours, right, like piecing together potential dots of like, damn, what possibly, like what really happened? Like Zora Neale Hurston taught at historically Black colleges across the South, and there are barely any records. I barely found the one document I found at Cookman that she actually worked there for like 2 semesters. Like it has taken so much possibility from us. And I think as a result of that, I think maybe the first thing I read about John Hope Franklin in one of his publications was talking about the impact of missing Black archives and like the intellect of Black people, right? And like what actually happens in like your education system, right? Because we know it all translates. Without archives, like archives don't just impact people's ideas around like history and culture, but it impacts policy, right? It impacts how we interact with each other. It impacts what is normal and what is not, and who is worthy and who is not, right? And if our stories are not told and we're always erased, then our people will never be seen. So I think the thing that we lost is something that I don't even know how to name, y'all, right? Because we actually won't know the truth because of the ways that like things have been hidden, because families don't want you to know, right? And then you can be sued if you really start putting together the dots, and then like, well, that's false, and then you become like you're demonized, right, for like sharing something that they probably couldn't have shared 100 years ago. But like, what would be possible if people could tell the truth, if we had more Lucille Diggs Slows? And who says that we don't? It could have been 1,000 Lucys out there, right? But like people burned people's diaries. They burned people's journals. They revised histories and said they were best friends, right? Instead of saying the truth about like who they were. Even the pictures that like we'll see with like Eleanor's, there's a famous picture, I think his name is like something Hicks, one of her bodyguards. Why randomly all his archives are missing? And these photos, like you see them in very close proximity. They were very, very close friends. And it was alleged that like he had this partner. He taught her how to shoot a shotgun. He bought her a first horse. Like all of these very queer relationships as we will understand them now. And like now people's shit is just gone, right? So this possibility. Like when you ruin and you like remove like the imagination, you kill generations of possibility.
Yeah, just kind of piggybacking off what Trinice is talking about. It's just, it's too many people thinking that they're the first or they're the only ones, and they're and it's like, oh my God, am I the first queer person here? And like, how do I experience this life? Because our and there is a duality to it though, because people understand that your longevity, your space in history is connected to your proximity to whiteness, your proximity to white supremacy, your proximity to patriarchy, all of these things. So if it's like, all right, if I have to cut out all the queer people, all the Black people, and make this as white as I can, so this story can be told, and like fingers crossed, some queer person 100 years from now will figure it out. But like that really shouldn't be the case, because there are way more queer people. There are way more, like how you got LGBTQIA and S, and you think that S is straight is more than everybody else. Like that's insane to think that like you have all these people of color, BIPOC and white, and we are all always looking at our proximity to whiteness to validate ourselves, to validate ourselves in education and in organizations and companies, all these things. So it's just, it's really a shame, I think. But it's definitely, for me personally, realizing all this stuff, learning all these things, because I was raised in a very Caucasian environment, probably more conservative than I had known at the time. And now like unlearning all these things, all of the things that I was raised with, I'm like, what is the purpose? What is the end? Like, how are we're really, the country's really just like striving to maintain something for a very small group of people who just have a huge accumulation of wealth. And that's really all we're fighting against, is for people to keep their money. And I would much rather people keep their money and let everybody be free than whatever we're doing right now.
Yeah, my tea is not as piping hot, but I will say that I think for me, when I looked at this question, I was brought back to, I think, the origin of our archive. I'm working with Penelope and Collective Resistance, and I'm grateful enough to be working with her because I reached out to a couple of groups just because I wanted it to be collaborative and community collected, rather than me kind of being at the forefront and going out to collect these stories. And in doing so and having original meetings and things, you can see like, I mean, you know, we're a group of women here, like we're men, we're still kind of trying to dominate this space and still trying to be a bit exclusionary. And, you know, like in coming to a radical archiving space, they were still kind of inhabiting these different isms and systems. And so it's a practice to kind of always be making sure that the archive is being as radical as it can be and is being as true to its purpose and not flying false to these different systems in the way that it can with the members themselves of the archive. So, yeah.
Yes, everything everybody said. I'm over here like, y'all out here preaching. It's so funny, when I was an undergrad at Temple University my senior year, I had a white woman professor from Yale, and she said to me, there were no Black people in Europe and Germany during the 19th century. And I was like, skirt, what, skirt? Wait, stop. I was like, hold up, you know, me. And this is an honors program. And she was like, and I was like, well, I think that there were. She's like, well, in my education, there were no Black people in Europe, or like she said Germany, but Europe, period, during this certain period of time. And it's funny, I didn't have the language back then, but you felt something was wrong. Like I felt something immediately in my spirit. I don't know if it's like my spirit being, my mind, maybe it was all together, but I knew something was wrong. And then as I got older, meeting one of my friends, scholar Araba, Evelyn Johnson Arthur, she's Afro-Austrian, and her talking about Afro-Germans, and then we Mayim and like Ika Hugel, and like showing our true colors, that book about Afro-German women speak out. And I'm like, wow, you know, I knew something was wrong. And I felt it. Another story I have is recently, you know, I run Black Women Radicals, everyone knows me. Okay, like, and I posted a photo who I thought was Marsha P. Johnson. because the white woman photographer had said this was Marsha P. Johnson. Come to find out, some friends at LGBT History who are so kind DM'd me and they were like, this is not Marsha P. Johnson. And I was like, this person, this photographer is credited on Aperture. I'm talking about like artsy, major artistic like outlets. And I'm talking about had a full write-up in a magazine, and they were like, this is racism, Jamie, because that's not Marsha P. Johnson. It's just another a darker skinned Black trans woman who they think looks like Marsha P. Johnson and was not only, they said misnamed, right? And so when I talk about that type of violence there, like while you were talking about Penelope, and also Zoe, you're talking about representation, like even when we look at the archives, we have to have a careful eye. Even when Black people are doing archives now, like Trinice was saying. I mean, you go on Howard's campus and that campus is queer as hell. Like I'm talking about, if it wasn't for queer folks, we wouldn't. Zora Neale Hurston was at Bohemian Caverns and would take her students there. And it's closed. Bohemian Caverns on U Street is closed now, but that was supposed to be a queer spot, a queer location. And she was, it was said to she was bisexual. And so what are we doing when we take these critical histories away? Like you said, Trinice, it limits the possibilities. And even with Allison, I remember going to, what is it, Alabama, and going to the lynching memorial and not knowing about Mary Turner, because when you talk about lynching, it's very gendered, very masculinist ideals of what lynching and also state and racialized violence is. And we're not talking about the multifariousness of violence, that it's not just police brutality, it's not just shooting, it's also other forms of violence. And to say that there's only one form of violence that only impacts one part of a marginalized group is very anti-Black to me. You know, so to say that only a state violence impacts Black cis men, I mean, like, let's expand the variables. So I think what everyone's talking about is like so on key and so on point. Yeah, and it's just the violence. We perpetuate that violence when we only look to the archives and not reimagine and transform what the archives are and can be. So yeah, this tea is piping. No.
Also, this, you know, when you were saying that example of Marsha P. Johnson, but the documentary that's on Netflix, I don't remember the name, something about Marsha P. Johnson's life, right? And that dude, whoever David, whatever his last name is, but he stole the work of I think I pronounced the name right, Tourmaline, and she's a Black trans artist, right? And that idea that you are stealing work, right? You're stealing work and then marketing it off to, I don't know, Netflix or big companies and saying, here's this work of, the life of a Black trans woman, and I'm stealing the work from Black trans women to profit off of the life of a Black trans woman, right? So it's like perpetual cycles of violence, right? When it comes to who even has access to archival work, who does the groundwork to dig up all of this, right? To dig up the life of Sylvia Rivera, to dig up the life of Marsha P. Johnson, to make all of these legacies and histories available, and then you can just take it and like run with it, right? Or white men too, can take it and just run with it. And you can get company deals and just profit and continuously profit off of work that you did not do, right? Work that does not belong to you, right? Either by community or by proxy. And it's so gross. It's just disgusting.
It's so disgusting. And my friend talked about that in academia too. It's everywhere, it's pervasive everywhere. But she was saying because people think that they stumbled across Afro-Europeans, that they're particularly US and Europe, you know, like, oh, I stumbled across these archives of Afro-Europeans. Meanwhile, there's Black people in Europe who've been there for, you know, centuries, right? And then we get to go back to the West or to the US and then say, oh, I'm the foremost scholar on Afro-Germans or Afro-Austrians, when there's Afro-Austrians who do the work. It's just about accessibility and who can have access, and also sites of imperialism, right? And so it's so important. Like when I go into Target now, Target, and I see like the LG, like during Pride Month, it was like the shirts, or Black History Month, and I'm like, what the hell is what just happened? Like really, like, I mean, people have done this work for it to be commercialized, exploited, pacified. And we see it on a micro level. I still think it's macro, but micro level in our everyday lives, when you're on the job and a white person or somebody steals your work and says it's yours, to a macro level with Tourmaline, she uncovered that work. You know what I mean? If it wasn't for her work, we would not have these archives. It would have been made accessible to us. And so, like, what are we doing? What is going on here? Yeah, it's just so violent. Does anyone else want to add to that before we transition to the next question?
One thing I'll add is just bringing it into the modern day. How we do this with archives is how we're doing this today. And Penelope, your example reminded me of like Cyntoia Johnson, and how that Netflix special, she was like, I literally didn't even speak to the people that made this movie. And they waited until Kim Kardashian starts sharing the story of her, and like, this girl's been sitting in prison for a very long time, but it wasn't until her story was like sexy and like appealing to white people that they just go make a full documentary about her without her consent, without her input, nothing. And it's like, okay, so now everybody's going to see this Netflix movie, and 100 years from now, that's what you're going to remember about Cyntoia. And she's alive. She can tell her story. And we have all of the technology to ensure that she tells her story in the way she will. And we're like, nah, let's make sure it's our way.
This reminds me of Zoe's point of representation. What was I about to say? Ooh, it just slipped my mind. But Amara Jones, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with Amara Jones, but she is a writer. She owns Translash Media. She's a journalist, award-winning producer. And she had a segment on BET. And it was about, the Black trans community and representations of Black trans people, particularly Black trans women on BET. And they cut her segment. And it's just very interesting how I see both sides. It's, we'll exploit this, but this is too controversial to put this here. And also we were talking about Pose. It's funny how Pose, has never, no Black trans woman has been nominated for a BET award. And it's just very telling how, like, oh yeah, we'll have a segment here talking about we love the Black LGBT community, haha, cute, whatever. But when it comes to not just symbolic representation or having like a face, but talking about people who are people being from the trans community being hired? Are they in positions where they are leading? Are they being paid the same? I mean, like, what is really going on? And I think when we talk about archiving, it's like Penelope was saying, it's not just, oh, this sheet of paper. It's like these, or even Trinice was saying, like, this is reality. This is, actualizations of what's going on and who gets what and who is this for, all sorts of things. But yeah, I was thinking about you, Zoe, with the representation piece too, like the uprisings. All of our Black trauma is up on that screen every freaking day. And I'm like, they're really profiting off our pain right now, because I don't see any other community other than Black and brown people. You would not see white folks up there on TV like that, suffering. And so, yeah, it's just so, whew, so much tea. Is it tea? It's so much foolishness. Does anyone else want to add before we transition? If not, we can go into the next segment, which I think is like very, very important. Tools for radical feminist archiving, suggestions, tips, advice, and encouragement. So there are a lot of people who are interested in obviously archiving. And like I said before in part one, you don't have to have a PhD, you don't have to have any degree to be an archivist. You just, need to be yourself and have an interest, and really want to invest in that. So my question for question 3 is, what advice would you give to those who are interested in engaging the archive as a radical tool for reclamation, restoration, and undoing revisionist histories? And what suggestions, tips, and even encouragement would you give those starting off?
I just have like a few brief ones, Jamie, and I'm really excited that you like mentioned what we talked about on part 1. Because some like folks started hitting me up and like, I really appreciate you saying that you don't have to have a degree, because some folks feel like you can't like be a legitimate, right? Like archivist. And I'm like, as a person that practices ATRs, right? Like all of these obituaries that we've accumulated for like the last 80 years in my family, like my grandmother was an archivist. My grandfather was an archivist. Like all of these newspapers, all of these bottles from like different places that we've traveled and newspaper, like that is archiving, right? And I think it's important for people. I'm not going to offer critique to academia right now. I think that that's not what today is about. But I mean, or is, right? Because I think it has a really fucked up way of like legitimizing or illegitimizing like who is important and like what work is valid. And I think that it's really important. There was, I'm doing this like project that I can't really talk about right now with the Smithsonian that I want to talk to the folks on this call about what does it mean to be archiving the Black radical tradition over the last like 10 to 20 years, and what does it mean to be working with institutions that have historically wronged us for hundreds of years, and like who do we give the skills to, like how do we access the skills to ensure that like we're telling our own stories. But I know that like when our communities are the ones that are creating and organizers are creating and activists are creating and our grandmoms is creating and our neighbors is creating and we're preserving our own records, it becomes more possible to form a complete and accurate history of like people's experiences and people's lives. And I think it's too important for us not to do it. We've seen what happens when we don't do it. And I just want to remind people, as a person that didn't learn about Black feminism at a historically Black college, and I have a graduate degree, who didn't learn about archiving in a practical sense at the institution I went to, that it's so possible, right, for you to do whatever the fuck you want to do. And you come from a lineage of people who have archiving, who have been collecting, amongst other things. So I just want to like remind people that, because in my political home is BRP 100, and we believe in holistic energy, and the Black joy experience is a part of the Black radical tradition. And we know we have people that have told us that music is not important, right? That aesthetics are not important. But like if you are a Black person or a brown person, that is very important to our culture. And aesthetic is very key. Looks matter, right? Like we have been able to preserve our history by photography, right? By portraits, by pictures. And we have been able to symbolize like key moments of our history. So just know that most of you are archivists already, and you may not feel like you have the practical training, but like there's some bomb ass Black folks on this call, right, that I know would love to tell you about like how you could formally do that. But just like reminding people, because I learned about archiving in the most formal way at my political home. We have things from one of our first actions in 2013 all the way down to Laquan McDonald direct action in 2015, right? Even though to last week on the corners when MPD and the Secret Service yesterday decided to shoot another Black man on the corner, right? Like we make sure that every time there's an act of violence on a Black person, like we have something and it is being documented somewhere so we can actually tell the truth. So just shout out to the people who are like, I ain't got no degree, I don't know what to do. Yes, you do.
Just gonna follow up. Yeah, I mean, right away when I think about archiving and accessibility, I think about this quote by Sada Shakur. Sorry if I butcher this, but she says like, no movement can continue or like survive unless it's like growing and changing with the times, right? So with that, we all know that we live in a technical age. We have the tools, a lot of us, we have more accessibility to tools to be able to show and document and create content that is true to ourselves and true to our communities. So I think it's realizing the power that you hold there inherently. Whether that is, I mean, like in the smallest sense, people may view this as small, but we're archiving every single day through social media. So just remembering that your story matters, and recognizing the power that you have and just like holding on to it, as cliche as that may sound. And then I feel like there's a lot of power in just recognizing recognizing DIY culture as it is. So academia aside, a lot of what Trini said, I mirror, and I'm not someone who comes out of academia. I am going into academia this fall, but still I'm not an academic, quote, end quote. But there's still a DIY culture that is very prevalent, which is a whole other conversation in itself. But with that, I think it's honing into those outlets and recognizing different makers and different artists, designers, content creators who are doing this sort of work and finding inspiration, and even if it's guidance or whatever it may be from them. With DIY culture, I do realize when it comes to zines and publications, sometimes it does still feel like a space that needs to be decolonized in itself. It is a very white space in a lot of places. That comes with a lot of institutions. But with that, it's still just finding those collectives that are doing the work. Off the top of my head, I think of Press based in Baltimore, Brown POC owned print space that's creating really, really great content and publishing a lot of really great DIY zines. Another one out in, I want to say they're in Oakland, Brown Recluse Distro, I want to say. I'm going by their Instagram handles, y'all. So sorry if I'm like not saying the correct name, but also creating a lot of really, really great content. And even bigger names like Print and Matter right now, in response to everything that's been going on, they have been releasing a lot of really great content by Black and Brown authors and makers. So finding those sort of spaces too, to realize, hey, that's something that I do every single day, or that's something that I'm doing inherently. Let me try and do it in this sort of way, whether it's through print, whether it's through digital archiving on social media or a website or whatever it may be. Just realizing that you have a lot of power inherently and just honing into that. Yeah.
I think the advice I would give is probably just a lot what I learned from Project X, a teach-in that I went to with Stephanie Alvarado, who's also a Bronx poet and archivist. And she like really instilled that the archive is not just this final object and this end all, it's a process and it's ongoing. And when it's an archive where you're getting something in the present and you're involving folks, they're also the archivists and they're also kind of getting something. And so if it's not, if you see it only as transactional and as leading to this culmination, then it's not being as much as it can be, as much as we here on this call are like, the archive is something to draw from as a source of hope and inspiration and reimagination. And so to see it as the source that it is and the well of possibility more than just kind of a collection of happenings, I think is ultimately the best advice I got. Yeah.
I would say, and I feel like it's been said a few times, but yeah, anybody can be and is probably already an archivist. I honestly, and I feel like until I talked to you, Jamie, I was like, am I an archivist? Like, do I do this work? Like, I don't know. I have a business undergrad and a master's in social work. I don't know where I fit in this space. But I know that for my work, I know that without knowing our history, there's no way you can even think about changing the political and economic and social structures that are in place right now. But that's really knowing your history, not just knowing what they give you as history. And my father's Ugandan, and so I realized they have very little written documentation of anything. Like, we don't know how old my grandmother was. My dad's birthday is like a vague, we just go with March 19th. But it's so, and one thing I've learned is to trust oral history and not just documented oral history, but like if somebody tells me something, I'm like, yep, that's probably true. And it doesn't matter how many books I read, how many websites, social media posts, or whatever that contradict that statement. If you tell me that, it's true. And if you tell me that about your lineage, your history, it's true. Because oral history is how Black people, how Africans have sustained for so long. They didn't need to write everything down. White supremacy is what kept us from, what cut off oral history for sure. So I've just learned to definitely trust people's stories from those people rather than people's people's pictures of how they want to paint someone else's story.
A side note, Angelica, Zasa Uptown, listen, I love y'all page. I love the work that y'all do. Like, I am such a fan of the work that y'all do. And that brings me, I think, to the advice, which I don't like, I'm not in a position to give advice, but I think creativity and specifically the arts. So I know, Zoe, you mentioned like zines, and I think some other folks have mentioned other creative ways too. But when I'm thinking about the ways that we can archive, or the ways that we tap into archiving is, I'm thinking about photography. I'm thinking about the moments where my mom, she like every Christmas, she's like, you guys have to buy me picture frames. Like, I want picture frames. I'm like, Ma, you don't need no picture frames. Like, you have some, like, it's okay, you know? Or even, you know, when I like facilitate a zine making workshop with young people, and I ask them to bring part of themselves into this workshop, and with the hope and the intention that, you know, whatever they create, they're able to keep as a momentum for self, but also as a momentum for moments when they're 25 and they're like, oh my God, like this is where I was in this moment in time. And maybe it lives longer and maybe it doesn't. And sometimes that's okay, right? Sometimes things, you know, disappear, and sometimes that is okay. But yeah, I'm thinking about reading. I really love to read, and I think somebody had mentioned Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and Gumbs is like one of my old time favorites. Like, if you're out here, like, let me know, because I love you so much. But she is the M Archive. Somebody mentioned Dub, and Spill, Scenes of Black Feminist Fugitivity. And I think that that is a way that archiving exists, right? It's through poetry. It's through the ability to be able to map out stories that maybe don't make sense by themselves, but maybe they make sense together. And maybe we just need to offer them that sort of grace or that sort of creative hint, right? In order to build parts of our community and build parts of our identities. And I don't know, I think for me that's, when I think about archiving, that's automatically where my brain goes to. It goes to the sort of visual like imagery, and the imagery that I'm able to create with like on a computer, or, you know, with my hands. I'm a digital artist, so that's sort of like what I lean a little bit more towards. But also the works of Black feminists that have completely shaped my life, right? And completely have taken my life into a trajectory that, you know, when I was 16, never in a million years would I have thought that this is where I would be, right? And I think that is a powerful tool to be able to tap into when we're thinking about archiving, to really give ourselves to the creative that exists within us, to give ourselves to the work of, you know, if you're a Black feminist, to give yourself to the work of Black feminists that have come before you, many of whom are still here, and who can guide you right through their text, or through their theory, or through whatever it is that they create, but that can guide you to understanding what is it that you need to hold sacred, and maybe that thing that you need to hold sacred for yourself is something that, you know, should be stored and should be kept, right, and should be archived, so that you can tap into it later, or so that other people can tap into it later, you know, long after you're gone. And then I'm also thinking about, you know, the ways that people plan for their texts and their work to be archived in the future, like long after they're gone. I know like some authors like sell their work to libraries, and I don't really know how any of that works, but they sell their works to institutions, to library, and they like, I'm assuming is a contract or something saying like for 75 years after I pass, this institution is going to like hold my records and hold these things so that people can study them. And we can do that for ourselves, right? Like we can and should do that for ourselves. We can and should do that for our communities, for our people, for the spaces that we call home, because these stories are sacred, and they're sacred simply because they matter to us, right? They don't have to be sacred for any other reason. They are sacred simply because they matter to us. And because of that, we should extend, the same care and love that we would want to extend to the work of people we admire, which is great, right? But we're also great. And we also can create and hold our things for ourselves. And Angelica, listen, I'm gonna DM y'all because I love the work that you all do. I don't think I could say that enough.
Listen, I'm gonna just shout out a few dope archivists. Caribbean Archives, please follow them. Like, I'm serious. Zainab, Floyd, amazing, amazing, amazing. And I think you said Angelica I've never met Angelica. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay. Black Lesbian Archives, Crew Make Do, amazing. Sarita Gates, amazing. Y'all are amazing. I'm like, there's so many things going on in my head talking about just like there's so many amazing Black and Brown archivists out there who are doing the work and who are changing our lenses. And I think we need to really like, when I go outside, I really walk outside, I really have to change my mind and my lens because we walk on hollow ground every day. Like you're talking about the sacred. We do not realize the ground that we walk on. We are walking on indigenous ground, right? But we're also, there are Black and Brown people that are there that have been there for a long time. And it's not just a spiritual feeling, but there are certain things that I've picked on as I've started archiving even more and getting into, for example, in DC, there's a street called Nanny Helensborough. I mean, for the longest time, I've been on that street and would never think about who's that street named after? And who is this? I didn't know it was a Black woman years ago, but it's named after a Black woman who was a pioneering educator in Washington, DC. Or when I'm in Philly, off of Broad near Temple University's medical campus, there is this, and I've been seeing this mural, there's murals everywhere in Philly, but there's this mural of this Black woman, and her name is escaping me now, so please forgive me. But when I drop off, when I went to Temple or when I was, dropping off a family member at Temple, I would see this Black woman's face. And I looked her up a couple of years ago, and she was a pioneering senator, one of the first Black women senators for Philadelphia. So I'm like, I guess I'm getting as a tip is that the archives are all around you. We are living archives. We will pass one day. What legacy are we going to leave behind as ancestors? Like, you can speak to your elders in your family. Like you said, Penelope, you can record yourself. From, I was 20, I'm not gonna reveal my age, but I was some odd, however years old, and how I'm 50, 60 now, you know what I mean? Or going outside and wondering, why is this street named after this person? And we have been blessed with a blessing and a curse with the advanced technology, right? But then also the flip side is too, we need to be engaging our community, because like Crew Make Do of the Black Lesbian Archive said, if they get rid of social media, what will we have? If they get rid of the internet, you see what Trump is doing with TikTok, right? If he can do, if we get rid of the internet, what do we have? We have each other. And so I just want us to realize that we are all walking archives. The people next to us are walking archives. We have a plethora of information. Let's share it. Let's work together, whether we like each other or not, but preferably work with people you like, because this is how we make history. So that's all I have to say about that. The archives, the archives are all around you. So is anyone else want to add to that briefly before we transition? I guess not. Y'all done preached the whole sermon, right? So no, yeah, this is really great, right? So the last question, and we're perfectly on time for this. It's great because I want the last 30 minutes to be questions from the audience. But the future of Black and Brown feminisms, the archive as feminist political education. So question for the last question is, in your opinion, how can archiving be a tool for feminist political education? And in the future, what are your hopes for Black and Brown feminists in terms of archiving, political education, resistance, and more? I know, such a loaded question. Don't be scared, go ahead.
Well, I'm a youth worker. I've been a youth worker since I was a young person myself. And how can archiving be a tool for feminist political education? I think that, so I was facilitating a program a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that we watched was in order to, to talk about like different leaders of like movements and pioneers, etc. We were watching like different small like documentaries and tapping into pieces, etc. So one of the films we watched was Happy Birthday, Marsha. And, most of the young people did know who Marsha P. Johnson was. You're talking about like high school age students who they have access to the internet. They're like following the same Instagram pages we follow. They like know, they're in the know. And then after watching the documentary, or the film rather, we were talking about what is it that, debrief, what is that you like, what is it that stood out to you, etc. And one of the things that happens throughout the film is that there's like excerpts or like small clips of an interview that's happening with Marsha. And it's a beautiful film. Folks should definitely watch it. And after we talked about that, we did an activity where I have the young people create their own sort of like retellings, like what are the stories of yourself that you would want to like exist after, in like 10 years, or like when you look back into your journal or whatever, what is something that you would want to remember in this moment in time, or things that you wish you knew about yourself that you now know, that are now very clear to you. And to me, right, that was an archiving project, right? Because it is their ability to practice, reflection, like be reflective in what are the things that they know now, what are the things that they wish they knew, how is it that this film or whatever this thing that I'm watching impacted my feeling, that I feel seen, do I want more, etc. And then it is also a potential to have this sort of thing that you write down to still be in existence 10 years from now, right? When, they're like living their lives in the best ways that they possibly can. And that is an opportunity, right, or was an opportunity to introduce the practice of archiving to these young folks, right? To be able to say, there are things that we're learning every single day, and, in this specific learning space, it was specifically a Black feminist learning space. So there were things that they knew that maybe they're not exposed to in school, but it also gives them the opportunity to say, the things that are, again, I hold sacred, the parts of my identity that maybe people in this room know that other people don't know about. These are all things that I can write down in this book, and these are all things that I can keep with me. And these are all things that I can reflect on, and things that I can hand or pass down to whoever comes after me. And that is archiving work, right? I think that there's so many simple ways that we do it, that we have the opportunity to do it with young people. But I think that when people typically think of archiving, they're thinking about a degree, right? You need to be a historian. You need to like know how to preserve documents in this library with this machine who's gonna do whatever. And it's like, no, it's actually very, very simple, right? Here's the paper, right? We're gonna get a photo album together, and we're gonna put these things here together for you to keep. And then I also think that as as a youth worker, you also have a responsibility to archive for young people, right? As a youth worker, there are pieces that these young people wrote during this program that are like sitting on a drive right now, and it is my responsibility to put that in a booklet, mail it to their house, or email it to them and be like, here, I need you to have access to this because what you created was important and is important. And if it's not important to you, it's important to me. And I think you should still look at it if and when you can, right? And that's more work, right, for an educator or for a youth worker or whoever. But if we really care about the things that young people want to learn and the things that they want to hold sacred and the parts of their identities growing, then we need to be able to do that sort of extra archival work for them, and then tap them in and bring them into that work when they're good and ready, right? So yeah, so that's something that I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Again, I really appreciate that offering, Penelope, because of the work I do with young people and helping them to realize how important like they are a part of our movement. And even though like we're teaching them consistently about what has happened, I mean, I see archiving the reason why political education is possible, right? Like there would be no political or popular education without archives, like of all sorts. And I think someone mentioned TikTok, I don't know if it was Jamie, but like that's a clear attack, right? And like young people are getting politicized right now on TikTok. I done learned some shit on TikTok that I was like, okay, 30 seconds, I've been dragged, right? But like it's so possible that like for young people to make shit digestible without the jargon and like be in conversation through popular education, which is really just much cooler political education. And I think it's important that we see pop ed and political ed as like a strategy, right? And in terms of what political education could look like, but really like as a study of like what are our wins and what are our losses as an organizer, right? Not an academic. The archives will teach us, and that if we're clear and if we're willing, I would say Mary Hooks likes to say to be willing to be transformed in service of the work. That requires to go to the archives, right? That requires you to learn some history, and the history that's not exciting, right? The history that you did not learn in school, but like really spending the time. And that's just my offering from an organizing lens. It became really clear to me that like, oh, I need to do some reading. I need to at least be looking at some photographs. I need to be hitting some websites. I need to be having conversations with our elders. I mean, even to live in DC, we have so many SNCC folks that are just around on, they still be on U Street. You could find them at Starbucks. You could check them out. They're the reasons why we even have DC like council members, right? Like if we really will go back to like who are the folks that made material conditions like what they are for us now. And just like as an organizer, I didn't learn the power of archives until we were having political educations about the early 1800s and 1900s and like who was actually responsible for Black feminist thought. Right? Like who are the women that we should be thinking about before we get to the CRC, right? Or before we get to the suffragettes. So that's my offering.
Yeah, now from that, I have a few floating ideas around or a few floating things going on in my head. But yeah, right away, I think about this other quote by Assata Shakur again, because there's always so many gems, but like, I remember her just talking about how like the first thing that the enemy tries to do like to revolutionaries is isolate them from the masses, isolate them from people in order to make us look like hideous, or I think she says like hideous monsters, so that people hate us, right? So with that said, we all know that there's a divide and conquer tactic always, and especially in US society, to make Black people seem like they're othered, or just Black, brown people othered, that they're fringe people, all of that. With that said, recognize that your act of archiving, which I'm gonna touch on that language, but your act of archiving is inherently an act of resistance, no matter what you're doing. So just recognizing that, like I was saying before, that you already have the tools in your hand to tell your own story. With that, using the word archiving, I feel like there's always, a few of us have already said this, but there's always this academic connotation to the word. You feel as if you might not be in a certain realm or have certain experience, or feel like you don't have the experience to be able to call yourself an archivist. You can do that. Anyone who is collecting histories and retelling it, you're an archivist, right? So recognizing the power there. And then the third point that I wanted to make was just realizing that, man, how do I state this? I guess just like recognizing that any experience that you may have comes with the history before it, right? So if you have the privilege, because I realize this is a privilege for some, to be able to speak to your elders, like Trinice was saying, speak to that person that you know was a part of a certain organization, movement, whatever. Take the time to do that. Recognize how your experience has gotten here. Read the books, get well acquainted with the scholars or different people who are just speaking about your experience or whatever experience it is that you're, you know, interested in archiving or being a part of that history telling. It's really, really important to make sure that you actually know somewhat of where you come from or what you're talking about before you start telling other people about it. Yeah.
To be honest, I've been so wrapped up in everybody's answers that I low-key forgot the question, but I'm going to shoot and try my best. I've been reading a lot lately about like Indigenous people in Africa and Indigenous Americans or Indigenous people to this land, and realizing like the way we kind of qualify our advancements, we are so far behind based on where Indigenous people were when white people came and wiped them out. And we were just like kind of recreating all this stuff. And like, even like this idea of like a paleo diet, like that's what people ate before, before y'all fucked up the food system, right? So I think just, the idea of like trust in your gut, because I feel like a lot of times when you are actively unlearning white supremacy and you're actively becoming more true to yourself and your lineage and who you are as a person, though your first instinct is likely more correct. I feel like we have a tendency to redirect. Okay, will this be taken correctly? Will this be accepted? Will I be deemed as too radical? But really, radical is the idea that we can like subjugate all these people and control all these people with wealth and all that stuff. Like we're living our lives, and I feel like that is the best thing that you can just trust to move forward and document it. And that's what archiving is. And that's what I'm learning that archiving is. And so I'm gonna just keep rambling if I don't stop right here. But yeah, I think just going back to like the Indigenous practices and trusting gut instincts and gut reactions, I think is helpful for me.
Yeah, Allison, same. I've been like just wrapped up in everyone else's answers. I'm like, wow. But I have so many quotes going around in my head. But I think one to start with is this principle that a lot of Indigenous nations have, that is like, you are doing the work, you should be doing work now for 7 generations to come ahead of you. So any archiving work that you are enraptured in right now, any archiving that you do even on social media, any kind of political resistance act that you do, it should be not only for your generation, for the next one, but how are you laying the groundwork? And how is that future 7 generations going to come back, and what are they going to learn from what you drop down now here? So I think that is a really prominent component of archiving as a feminist tool. And I think also I keep thinking about Arundhati Roy's piece and how the pandemic is a portal. And I love archives because I see them too as portals in this like magical space where you are not only revisiting and going back, but you're also laying creating this space to think with those learnings, kind of those Black feminist blueprints, and using that to build and go forward. And so I think archiving as that space and honoring that and really sitting in that is powerful, and it's something that I hope a lot of future Black feminists, Black and brown feminists, take from archiving as a tool. And lastly, I think, yeah, going back to what Penelope said, like part of our archive is hoping that everyone takes on this artistic component that we've asked them to do. Like not only interview and speak to your elders and talk and go back and investigate, but also create something out of that. Like what does that spark for you? And do an artistic manifestation of that and share that and keep that as well. So yeah.
Yes, everyone with these amazing answers. I'm so happy because it's like I'm there's so many things to talk about with this, but in wrapping up, I would say there's a couple of things in terms of how we can strategize or use archives for feminist political education. I think one, we need to make sure we're checking our arrogance. Like Allison and Ayling, you were both saying, and I think Trinice, you said earlier, and everyone said, Zoë, Penelope, about we're not the first to come here. We're small iterations of Black and brown feminists coming to this work. And I think in terms of building feminist political education and in terms with the archive and strategizing and working together and collaborating, we need to recognize we are not the first, we will not be the last. This is a continuation. And I think a lot of times there's this arrogance like, oh, we're the young people here that we're going to correct and rectify the wrongs of our elders. But if it wasn't for our elders, we would not have this blueprint to even bounce off on. So I think we have to, and I think there's a lot of times it comes with social media, we think we're coming up with these new theories. And no, if you read Toni K. Bambara, if you read This Bridge Called My Back, if you read Homegirls, they're having the same discussions that we are having now. Literally. Maybe in a different time, a different context. So I think that's one thing, to really check our arrogance or check our, like that we're these Black and brown feminist saviors when this is not the case. We're part of this long legacy. I think another thing too is that history is not in a silo. Like there's not just like this Black feminist history here and then like the next 50. I mean, there are a lot of histories happen. There's a multitude of histories going on at once, right? And in terms of building, for me, I try to look at cross-racial solidarities right now because I think we need each other more than ever. I think we need to be working with radical, first of all, working for me as a Black feminist, working with other Black women, gender nonconforming and non-binary folks and working together. But I also think working with radical feminists who are dedicated to this work. For example, I work with the Asian American Feminist Collective, and someone critiqued and said, well, why would you work with Asian women? They don't do nothing for the Black community, and not realizing Grace Lee Boggs and Angela Davis, or Yuri Kochiyama, who was best friends with El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, who we know as Malcolm X, and was there holding his head when he was assassinated, and who was dedicated to Black and Asian feminist solidarity. So I think we need to really, like Trinice said, go back to our readings and really undo and decolonize what white supremacy doesn't want us to come together. They don't want, the working class folks or even across races and genders and sexual orientations, identity. They don't want us to come together, right? So how our histories intersect, but also let's recognize our differences too. And we need to recognize that we hold prejudices and certain things against each other. How do we decolonize that? How do we decolonize our arrogance? How do we decolonize our wantingness to be charismatic leaders, so that we can come together and really have a holistic history and present and future for the future generations to come. So I think that's what I would leave from that. We ain't the first, we ain't gonna be the last, period. No. No, I need to stop. But anyway, I listen to too much City Girls because I love when they say period. I'm a job, I ain't doing a job. Okay, anyway. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it. Yeah, we have tons of questions also. It ain't over. We still got 30 minutes, right? And so someone asked before I move into that, does anyone else want to add to that before I move on to the questions? I don't want to be rude. Period. Okay, let's see. Question, Nicole asks, our newly formed campus archivist group is split about what is the priority in this moment, whether to address the history of Black presence on our campus or to support students' original new work, new responses to Black Lives Matter and current students' lives. What would you prioritize, or how do we do both? Context: I've been organizing with Black, brown, and white academics at my state university to be more than we have been for our Black students. Low Black student numbers, high attrition.
I just want to say you have to do both, right? And if you want to be accurate in the ways that y'all are organizing now and prioritizing whatever the issues are now, it's impossible to do that without going back, right? Like, I think it was really important that Jamie asked it's a sankofa question. I'm also confused because I see that you say artivist and not archivist. So yeah, I think you have to address the history of Black presence on the campus, and you also have to support students' work. And by supporting students' work, that doesn't mean just allowing students to do whatever they want. That really requires political education. And that political education is the information you're going to get from going back and learning about the history at the institution and the ways that the folks have organized it before you. But you have to do both, because we've seen what happens when folks don't do both, when we think we're recreating some new shit, you know, because we're not, we never are.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of Trinice. One inherently informs the other. You can't do one without the other. You can't inform people of history without acknowledging previous history. So I can't really tell you exactly how to go about that because I'm not sure exactly what your end goal is, what you're trying to achieve aesthetically. But I think it's just like Trinice said, making sure that you do the groundwork of making sure you're well informed of previous or your past experiences there, and then taking on the new experiences and seeing how one and one mold together. Yeah.
Yeah, does anyone else want to add, or should we move on to another question? I think we're good. Thank you for that question, Nicole. So someone's EC2 Gay. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but hello. First off, I just wanted to say I enjoyed this talk so much. My question, or rather request from the panel, if possible, is if there is any must-read literature you can recommend to someone who is just starting out on this journey and wanting to learning more. Anyone have any literature to recommend?
Penelope, I saw you get excited because I know you.
I don't know. Y'all be seeing, I don't know if any of y'all follow the Collective Resistance page. I'd be like citing things in our in our captions. It's a mess over here. I think I don't think I have any texts that come to my forefront in regards to like archiving, but like Black feminist texts, sure, absolutely. I'm sure we all have a lot. I think like you have to start, if you haven't done so already, you have to start with the Black feminist statement. Like I feel like you have to start there. The Combahee River Collective. One of my favorite anthologies is Words of Fire. I actually don't, I think Beverly, oh my God.
Chef talk about it.
Yes. And y'all just had the event. So Words of Fire is like absolutely one of my favorite anthologies. One of the collective members is like reading it right now as we speak. And I think if you have like other like homies who are like trying to tap into like Black feminist texts, that can be like a really good starting point. Bilfina also has her Bilfina's library, like her open public library, and she has so many texts there. I don't think she has a copy of Words of Fire there, but she has another anthology, and Some of Us Are Brave is in there, and I think that that's another great place to start. These are, you know, the anthologies, of course, like they're composed of like small essays and smaller pieces. I think I prefer sometimes anthologies as starting spaces because you have the ability to dissect things with groups of people in a way where you can build off of the text that just came or the text that is coming after. And I feel like that feels the most feasible to me. I mentioned in terms of poetry and like archiving through a creative space or like fictive archiving almost. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, her trilogy, Spill, Scenes of Black Feminist Fugitivity, the M Archive, At the End of the World, and then Dub. I don't know if Dub has a subtitle, but those are all like really, really great texts. Yeah, I don't know other folks.
I just added like the Punks, Bull Daggers, and Welfare Queens by Dr. Kathy Cohen. That really helped politicize me and ground me and like what it meant to be queer. So that might be helpful. And then Insight, Women of Color Against Violence and Critical Resistance, Statement on Gender Violence in the Prison Industrial Complex. The folks who wrote that are all coming from the Black feminist school of thought. So that also could be helpful. And we also want to include the offering that Jamie asked us in the beginning with Sadia Hartman in that article around like patriarchal violence and the role in archiving. That could be helpful.
Definitely. I would also say when we're reading, like for example, Homegirls and This Bridge Called My Back, like those are women, Black women and women of color stories that they collected, poems. Those are forms of archives as well. And so like that can also give inspiration and be like, hey, I'm gonna collect my homies' poems and essays and whatnot and put them out there for the world to see and showcase like we are keeping our stories alive, even when I will say that now black feminisms and womanisms are all the rage for all these publishing companies, right? But think about beforehand, Homegirls, Barbara Smith started Kitchen Table Press. I mean, she because people didn't want to listen about, if you read Audre Lorde's work, they didn't want her to talk about being a Black lesbian. Even Souls, like the Black Journal, did not want her to talk about her being a lesbian at all. So they created their own lanes, right? So let's look at these books and look at these essays and look at these histories and be like, let's create our own lanes. Even though people want Black feminisms are all the rage, create your own lane, right? Because someone is always trying to co-opt, exploit, pacify something, right? And so create your own lane, right? So let's see. Does anyone else want to add to that? Because there's other questions too.
One more book I would add, and this is one thing that I think is useful for me when thinking about archiving or creating is like fiction, but fiction work written by Black women and Black femmes. But Krik Krak is a really, really great text. The epilogue of that text is poetry in motion. Like, oh my goodness. So I would definitely recommend that. I'll add the link to the chat.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And this next question is, whoo, edge snatch. How do we ensure Black archives have the same institutional, social, and cultural authority as colonial museums? How do you feel about colonial museum abolishment and artifact is it reparation or repatriation? How else outside of the person archives can we liberate Black histories? Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. How else outside of the person archive, they have something underneath. How else outside of the person archive can we liberate, decenter, and decolonize the archive internationally? Excuse me. That was a loaded question. Lord, edges, snatch, gone. Singed.
This answer is definitely not enough, but it's how I've been working on it. I just try to check people when they give me white sources to figure out Black stuff. As simple as that. There are so many people writing about their own stories, and I know, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who exactly was talking about it, but I think Jamie, about Europeans and Black people in Europe that are writing their stories. And I feel like academia is gonna be academia until people overcome it, until people stop needing peer-reviewed articles to validate their thoughts. Like, I hate looking up articles because I'll write in grad school, I would write a whole paper and be like, this is wonderful. everything I say is right. Now I got to go look up sources for all this. And it was my thoughts, but now I have to validate it with 10 peer-reviewed articles that are written by people who witnessed this or read about this experience rather than lived it. So just stop going to that source, and eventually, if more people get on that train, it will stop being relevant.
Yeah, just going off of what Allison said really quickly. Yeah, it's just holding sources accountable, like you said, actually looking at who's writing what text, who's citing what information, and seeing if those people are even, for lack of a better word, like a good source for said information. I don't know, just like if you actually think that they're valid in what they're talking about. And then also, I think we're seeing, even though these resurgences have come up time and time again throughout the last 100 years, but we are seeing a reckoning right now that the power of accountability is holding, at least on a capitalism scale. So we're seeing all of these capitalistic companies that are now getting on board in whatever sort of motive that may be. But we realize the power that us actually holding these institutions accountable can hold. So collectively, if people do decide to actually hone in on what academia tends to do when they're rewriting history, erasing histories, not including certain pedagogy within their teaching curriculum, we all decide to hone in on that and collectively decide that, hey, this is a fight that we want to fight, which is a whole other conversation. I think there is power in that. And there's power in us collectively trying to decolonize an institution like that.
Definitely. I think we need to stop looking for our validation, like Allison was saying, in academia and also these colonial museums, because I'm not trying to go back to Black Panther, but when, Michael B. Jordan, I forget his character's name, was like, you stole this from, was it Killmonger? Yes. You and I saw it and I was like, wow, this is the truth. I mean, I love to go to museums and as a kid, I would go and not realizing, well, damn, they stole this from some ethnic group, from somebody's country. Like this is, somebody's archive. This is their relic. It's a shame. And like, I think we have to stop looking to academia at times for validity. But in terms of liberating the archive and connecting with people internationally, I think we need to really not just be so US centric when we talk about our archives, because like I said, our histories are connected, right? Even in terms of enslavement, my work is in Brazil. Brazil is the largest black population in the world outside of Nigeria, in the diaspora. So what can we go to Brazil to look at their archives and granted, it's in Brazilian Portuguese, right? But how do we connect with certain community groups or Black feminist groups who are doing the work and who do translate in English and in Brazilian Portuguese and also in Spanish? One I'm thinking about is the Quilombo Collective, and I'll drop their name, but they do their events in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. And that way you can learn about amazing historical Black women leaders that they say that are mythical, right? But they say our stuff is mythical, but then they be making up myths about us. Anyway, like Dandara dos Palmares, who was the queen of the Quilombo dos Palmares, which was a maroon community of enslaved and free Africans who created their own economic system. I can talk about Jamaican Independence Day, Trinice, was a couple of days ago, Nanny of the Maroons. A powerful Obeah woman leader who resisted the British. Like there's so many different cultural, historical leaders and markers that we can, particularly Black women, that we can look to, but we have to be willing to look. And even though there's a language barrier, like Mari Fajeda of the Quilombo Collective said, there's Google. If you have the privilege of having Google Translate, right? Because not everyone has access to the internet, right? Where people live in digital deserts, but you have the privilege of that. You can press Google Translate. It may not translate it all correctly, but you will get the gist, right? And so it's like, even learning another language, that could be another tool to liberate the archive internationally, right? So yeah, don't let these museums validate us, even though they do have access. Even like I'm speaking of place of privilege at Howard, I go to Howard. Not everyone can get in Moreland Spring Art, the archival, which is a house of major Black archives in the world. Not everyone can get in there. So how can I make that accessible? So what is my role, and how do I check my privileges? So that would be another thing. Anyone else want to add to that? I don't want to keep rambling.
I agree. I just also wanted to address what I saw in the comments. Someone said that all archivists, but all archivists aren't bad. What I wanted to offer and clarify is that we never said, right, that, academics were bad. We critiqued academia, right, and the impact of the shortcomings of academia, because academia mainly lives in higher education, which is an institution, right, which is inherently and systemically going to be impactful towards certain kinds of folks. And we know those folks are folks on the margins. So I just want to be really clear with you. Like, we never said that academia, that's not what we said. Some of us work in academia, but we're clear about the system, right? And the shortcomings of that system and who really benefits and who doesn't.
Yeah, definitely. Just piggybacking up what Trinice said, I'm sorry, I'm going twice, but yeah, I went to grad school and I appreciate my graduate experience. But I also went to predominantly, I went to GSU, Georgia State, for grad school, which has a large Black population, but it is a white institution. And I went to Fordham for my undergrad. So shout out to the Bronx, but they're also problematic as hell. But I love everything I got from my institutions and from being involved in academia, but I also couldn't be who I am today if I didn't look at it through a critical lens.
And also someone said cite Black women, or that said that every time I write a paper, I'm told by my mentors to refer to French critical theory or white scholars' writings on Black topics. Ooh, that is, I had someone say to me, why are you citing, like, you need to stop citing all Black women. I was like, okay.
Wow, they just hate Black women, don't they? They just really hate us.
They just, listen, it's a shame. Like, and it's like, so you look at all these like European philosophers, and I was like, it's Black, trans, queer, cis women have, gender non-conforming folks have outdid their simple behind theoretical frameworks anyway. Like, you ain't saying nothing but a word. Like, what are you saying? We Black feminists have eaten you up and spit you out. I mean,
Maslow who? Freud who?
Like, I mean, come on. I'm sorry. Let me stop being messy. Thank you, Sylvia Winter. Like, let's stop playing these reindeer games. Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. Okay, let me stop being messy. Let's see. I think there was another. Oh, someone else had a great question, and I think it was at Allison Esther says Allison's point about wiped out people's histories, because with that many objects, testimonies, and languages that can attest to the past are lost. What happens when there's little to archive? Where to go to recapture those histories?
Can you repeat the question, Jamie? I can't find it.
Yes, there's so many. It was Esther's question. Let me go back. The question, if I can summarize it, because I can't, I'm trying to find it, but where do you go when there's little to archive? What do you do? What are your next steps when there's little to archive?
I don't know where you go, but one thing I would say is don't do, and I think Penelope and Trinice touched on this earlier, is don't fill in the story with your assumptions of what is not available, because that just perpetuates the issue we have. So maybe somebody else in the panel can say where to go to find more information.
I think that that's the work, right? In regards to having to uncover the answers or the archives that might not be, again, like you said, Allison, readily or easily available. And then sometimes it's true, right? Sometimes things have been burned and they just cannot be recovered ever, right? And sometimes what we have, like Hartman was saying, you know, in Venus in Two Acts, sometimes all we have is a sentence of a violent act that brings the person into history, right? But we have to understand that this person, right, already existed before this violent act. Just because the sentence brought them into history does not mean that they're suddenly absolved from that history, right? Just because they don't exist in that written sort of word. Yeah, because the archive is the written word, right? That's the thing that we deem, right, in academic spaces, in professional spaces, deem as worthy is what can we see, what can we touch, like, is this written down? And understanding that sometimes we have to go to our oral histories, right? If that's something that is available in your community, that your community practices. And sometimes you have to create, right? And not necessarily to say you have to make up something about this person that you are trying to like uncover, right? Because that's also can be an act of violence on this person who is no longer here. It can be that, or it can be harmful. But sometimes to offer sort of like ourselves solace, we create these narratives, we create these sort of stories and say, maybe this person was like this, maybe this was the life that they lived. And sometimes, you know, from speaking from personal experience, sometimes that has to be enough because we don't have all the pieces that we may need to fully recreate a life outside of an act of violence, or outside of scraps of newspaper, or outside of one line in a text from 1605. Like, so sometimes that's all we have, you know? But I also think, you know, I said this already, but I also think that we have to remember that there's multiple ways to archive, and that requires us to be able to look through multiple forms of archives that exist, right? So not just the written word, but we have the oral histories, you know, we have photography, we have what Trinice was doing, piecing these things together and being like, oh, y'all was friends, okay, like, sure, right? But sometimes that requires, my partner's laughing, sometimes that requires like us to do that, right? My bad, I got distracted, but yes.
Does anyone else, Ayling or Zoe, want to add before I ask the next question? Y'all good? Okay, great. So Tamara actually had two great questions, but I'm going to ask the one that you asked in the group chat. So how might we hold space for radical listening and oral histories with elders in ways that are trauma informed and joyful? Do you have any examples? And I mean specifically holding space for trauma, emotions that come up from the ground in people. It's such an amazing question.
Yeah, I mean, right away, this question makes me think of, well, a reading one, the book that I mentioned earlier, My Grandmother's Hands, by Resmaa Menakem. I'll drop that in the chat just to make sure that I'm getting his name correct. But he does an excellent job of talking about the process in which he was retrieving oral histories and just his grandmother's experiences in her life through the practice of recognizing generational trauma. So that's a reckoning that, especially as people of color in this country and just internationally, it is definitely a practice. It's not something that is easy or something that should just be belittled. It is a practice, and recognizing certain things, specifically with elders that may have grown up in a certain way, learning certain practices or learning that certain things are not spoken about openly, it can take time. So I think that book does an excellent job of like giving if you're someone who's into exercises, but gives an excellent, you know, just plotting of how to go about that with older relatives, and then also practices for yourself that helps you realize certain internalized traumas or racialized traumas that you maybe haven't even confronted before. But yeah, I think it's just recognizing that the process itself is something that, one, both people have to be on board to talk about to an extent. So If you do have a relative that might really be shutting down at something, I guess it's just finding the tools and the language to actually talk about and hopefully open them up to having that conversation. But then at the same time, recognizing that people do have boundaries and just being keen and aware of said boundaries, not pushing people so far where you're just leaving them feeling exploited or uncomfortable. Yeah.
Hey, Ayling, I think you're muted. No. No.
Do you want to type it and then one of us reads it?
Okay. Well, while you're typing, I would say this has been difficult because I interviewed my grandmother and my great aunt, and they've lived through some things. And I wanted to get my grandmother's, personal story. And it was hard, I mean, it was to the point where like, she started crying, and it's like you want to know more about their lives, and you wonder why sometimes our elders may have like this like hard as steel personality, but these are human beings, you know what I mean, and they've lived through some things that we've lived through some things as well, but it's a different context, and they've seen so many changes. Just imagine growing up sharecropping and in Arkansas with 5 children, and what being segregated. I mean, even some of our parents, our guardians, have lived through like 1960 is not that far away. 1940, I mean, that's really not that far away. So, and we lived through that in our you can see how that generational trauma lives in our, when we talk about Black women and maternal mortality, or Black people and maternal mortality and all sorts of things. So like we carry these traumas. And so these are our elders. Like, how do you do that? And like Zoe said, boundaries. If someone is crying or someone feels uncomfortable, are you okay? Let's stop this. Let's, if you don't want to pick this up today, if this wants to be the end, and that we have to do that for each other, but also for and people that we don't know. I mean, I know even for my dissertation, you have to go through IRB, the Institutional Review Board. I mean, you have to have certain protocol to even interview and talk to people. And I think we need to have that same, I'm not saying it has to be the academic way of doing it, but have some sort of care and consideration and recognizing that this is a human being and that they've lived through some things. So that would be my spiel, my 2 cents on that. Wrote, I think this is Ayling. I think holding space for radical listening and being trauma informed, but making room for joy too, means knowing no 2 traumas are alike and being flexible in how you collect and curate the archive to account for everyone's experience to the best extent you can. Histories with elders in ways that are trauma informed and joyful are any examples? I mean, oh, she said I copied and pasted some of the question. Yeah, but that's what she wrote in the chat, so you can read it too. But I think Zoe, your work does this a lot too, like the Black joy, finding representations of Black joy, but also recognizing that Black and brown people have had to create joy out of dire circumstances. And like I said, we're some resilient as people to continue to do so. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I think the only thing that I would add is being explicit and truthful about what you're going to use the information for, because confidentiality is real. Like I asked my parents to interview them, and immediately they were like, are you writing something? Like, are you sharing this with people? And I was like, no, it's honestly just for me. Like I'm going to put it like in my diary or whatever. But that's important. Like if you say it's not going to be shared, don't share it. Even if it is like a huge revelation. And if you say it's going to be shared in a specific way, only do it that way, because that really deteriorates the trust and stops these sort of opportunities from happening.
I think the only other thing I would add, and I know this is more because I'm also thinking about IRB, but independent from like archiving or trying to like collect interviews from academia, if you're like gonna get paid for this, you need to pay the people that you're going to interview. If somewhere along the line somebody reads your blog post and they're like 10 G's, let's go, like, are you gonna write a book? Then you need to reach back out to those folks, ask for consent and be like, can this be in this book, that, you know, whatever. And then you also need to compensate people and compensate them fairly and well, because the only reason that your thing exists is because of that story, right? You might have come up with the overarching theme, right? Or you might have come up with the title of this thing, or, you know, not to invalidate that sort of work, but let's be clear that like the story lies in what this person offered, and they also need to be compensated for that work. And yeah, that's something that's not to be taken lightly either.
Definitely. And if you don't have the money to do it, you know, there's other forms of compensation, right? That's not necessarily monetary, right? If it's writing an article to help someone promote their project, if it's sharing something, if you have a huge following on social media, I mean, there's, if you don't have the money yourself, like, listen, I'll take you up on a drink or something, you know what I mean? Like, you know, I'm joking with that last part, but seriously, like, if there's anything that you can do to share or boost or other actions that are not necessarily monetary. So yes, and making your careers on the backs of people, off of backs of other people's gains. So many PhDs have done this, and yes, this is critiquing academia. You read about how people have changed people's stories or their words, you know, lying, forging things. I mean, it's so it's so many things, right? And so we have to be cognizant of that. So does anyone want to have oh yes, one more thing. I know we're past 3 minutes past our time, but someone said, can you put your Twitter handles in the chat, everybody? But does anyone want to have like one final word before we end this brilliant call? Y'all are so amazing. Someone was like, damn, this is over. Yeah, it is over. I'm so sorry. But yes, everyone is dropping their social media. Oh yes, I love Alicia B. Wormsley. There are Black people in the future. Yes, there are Black people in the future, most definitely. This was so great, everybody. Thank you so much for just being for part 2. I think someone asked earlier, you can watch part 1 on Black Women Radicals IGTV, and I also think on Collective Resistance as well. And we really appreciate you so much. To our amazing panelists, Penelope, Zoe, Allison, Trinice, Ayling. Thank you so much. Y'all are so poppin'. I hope I can be like y'all one day. Really just a pleasure. And does anyone else want to have final words before we close out? You have the floor.
I'm about to go. Just a reminder that all of y'all are badass on this panel, and all of you that engage in this conversation with us clearly are archivists or budding historians. So shout out to y'all.
Thank you, Trinice.
Yeah, quick word. I was going to say exactly what Trinice pretty much said, but thank you guys for tuning in. Anyone who's here is a part of this movement. So just remember that. And just one tiny plug. The Black Joy project that I'm working on actually drops next Thursday, August 20th. It's going to be digitized online at blackjoyarchive.com. And then there will also be print books, 30 copies of print books. Actually, I have one right here. But a print book that will feature over 60 submissions by Black voices and their experiences. So that will be available for sale, and 100% of the proceeds will be going to 2 organizations. But more details about that will be on the website. Yeah.
Woo! So dope. Congrats, Zoe. Anyone else?
Thank you, Jamie, for holding the space for us. You always, you always praise other people, but a lot of this work is possible because of you. And like the work that you do with Black Women Radicals is absolutely amazing. So thank you for being in this space, for holding this space, for offering everything that you offer through your work.
Thug tears. Thank you, Penelope. I get so embarrassed. Like it's just like I can't hold. So thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Same for you, Collective Resistance. Amazing.
Yes, thank you so much, Jamie. And this is the perfect example of how to compensate people, giving people a platform, inviting them into conversation, and validating their experience and their thoughts and all that stuff. So you are amazing. And thank you so much for having me here and having this amazing group of people here.
Oh, thank you, Allison. I'm trying to accept it, but I can't. But thank you so much. Y'all are so amazing.
Y'all hear me now? Yes, okay. Just in time. Yeah, I mean, to reiterate everything, thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you all to all panelists for being here and being in this space and doing the work that archiving is, because it's work, but it's beautiful and radical work too, and paving the path for a radical future. So thank you all. And I guess the only plug is that Collective Resistance and I's archive is still ongoing. So if you know a Black and Brown essential worker, because this pandemic is still going on, even though like people want to act like it's not, it's still happening. So Black or Brown essential workers who you know, interview them, make art out of it, and then submit to the archive. So yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the panelists. This was so amazing. I'm gonna come back to this and take more notes because y'all was dropping knowledge. But anyway, I appreciate y'all so much, and be safe out there. And maybe one day we can have part 3. So you never know. All right, y'all have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Be safe out there. Thank you.